Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the City Council Planning Committee work session on renter barriers and concerns. I'm going to read the summary statement, then April will introduce everybody and we'll get started. A significant number of Bellingham community members reside in rental housing. Recently, a number of concerns associated with renters and rental properties have been brought to the Council's attention through testimony given during Council's public comment period. These concerns include how best to provide information on tenants' rights and the responsibility of those who rent, as well as source of income discrimination. In response, the Council has approved several work sessions with the Planning and Community Development Committee to learn more about rental barrier concerns, landlord management perspectives, and other relevant information. For the first in the series of work sessions, the committee has invited community members whose work relates to the initial concerns presented to discuss these issues and share their unique perspectives. There will be 10 minutes at the end of the meeting for public comment. So I'll now turn it over to April, who brought this forward, and we'll go from, maybe you can introduce everybody, April.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Well, it might be easier for everybody to introduce themselves, but I appreciate everybody coming. This is a really unique opportunity for us to learn a little bit better the concerns that we've been hearing in 3-minute prompts at the dais, and kind of just investigate that, just a really informal conversation. You'll probably get a lot more discussion kind of us back and forth, probably a little less of us back and forth at this point. So thank you for taking the time out of your day and coming, and if you would go ahead and introduce yourself. Galen?
Cool. My name is Galen. I use he, him, his, and I'm the local issues coordinator for the Associated Students of Western Washington University, and I'm also here as a member of the Bellingham Tenants Union, which is a new group that I'm a part of.
I'm Greg Winter. I'm Executive Director of Opportunity Council, and as you are well aware, we have a variety of housing assistance programs.
I'm John Harmon. I'm Executive Director of the Bellingham Housing Authority and the Whatcom County Housing Authority, and we also specialize in housing programs, and we've got altogether about 3,500 households that we assist in Bellingham and Whatcom County.
Well, I think, Galen, it might be appropriate, because I know a lot of the students were the ones who came to the meeting to bring up some of the concerns, and you have the agenda for your local, help me, Students Association? Is that right? So maybe you could share with us a few of the policies that you all have been advocating for this year.
So at the council meeting before the last, students came mainly to talk about requesting more information on tenant rights be provided to tenants upon move-in. And this is something that was brought to our attention because throughout the year I've heard a lot of students of not knowing their rights, dealing with unresponsive landlords, not getting repairs done in time, people's security deposits being taken unfairly. They feel like at the end of their tenancy. And in looking around the country for what other municipalities have done, we saw that Ann Arbor, they provide their tenants with a packet of tenant rights and responsibilities when they move in. And I think something like that could be really beneficial here. And it was brought to my attention by Brian that actually in the rental safety and inspection program, there is a municipal code that already allows or encourages landlords to provide tenants with information on tenant rights and responsibilities, and it's up to the discretion of the director. And from conversations with Rick, I think a big question is enforcement, and how do you do something like this without it being really cost prohibitive, and how do you actually make it so that this is happening and you can check in on it. So that's a big one. And then
Galen, I forgot to introduce everybody here. I'm sorry. Councilwoman Barker is on the committee with me, and Councilman Hamill, Rick Sepper from the Planning Department, Brian Heinrich from the Mayor's Department, Peter Rafato from the City Attorney's Office, and Kurt Navafeld, Senior Planner, hiding in the corner over there. So go ahead, Galen. I'm sorry.
Okay. So that was one thing. And then the other items on our agenda that relate to protecting tenants and helping make housing more accessible. We were advocating for capping move-in fees and application costs that landlords can charge incoming renters, and offer renters the option to pay their move-in costs in installments with no interest. And we brought that forward because we had heard from students, especially low-income students, that it's sometimes hard to pay that first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposits, sometimes non-refundable cleaning fees, all that together. And if I put my Bellingham Tenants Union hat on, one of the things that we've been doing is canvassing throughout Bellingham, talking to renters at the door, and mainly just listening and hearing what concerns people have. And the high cost of move-in fees has been brought up as something that was difficult for people to get into places, or hard for people to move out of bad situations that they're in, because they don't have that money to pay those move-in fees. Yeah.
That would probably, I'm assuming when you say getting out of a situation, is that somebody may have your last month and your security deposit. And I think most times, being a landlord myself, we have 30, 60 days to give that back. I can't remember what the number is. And so sometimes if that's your main savings, but it's sitting in somebody else's pocket, that can be difficult to go and seek out if you have to bring it all up front. You don't have that time to get that. Is that what some of the concern is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I heard from one lady who was in a hotel for 14 months, she said, because she couldn't get the money together to pay those initial move-in fees. And that was really hard on her and her family. And then the other thing that we've especially heard canvassing is source of income discrimination, where people with Section 8 housing vouchers are denied housing from a lot of different property management companies and landlords straight off the bat because of their source of income. And there's been,
The source of income, not lack of, it just where the money's coming from, that's what they're zooming in on?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And it's not only Section 8, sometimes it can be, there's veteran affairs supportive housing vouchers and other forms of housing support that people get. And those people can face discrimination by landlords. And a number of municipalities in Washington have banned this source of discrimination. Seattle, Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, Renton, Olympia, Tumwater, Vancouver, and unincorporated King County. So it's something that a lot of other municipalities have taken action on.
Yeah, I don't have any particular presentation. I'm just wanted to be part of the discussion. I'm really pleased to be invited. A couple of things, just segueing after Galen. As far as tenant rights, I will say that at Opportunity Council and other housing providers, as a matter of course and policy, and sometimes it's compliance with various grants, we make sure that whenever we're helping somebody with housing assistance, we provide information on tenant rights, information on the Landlord-Tenant Act, and there's a handout that's regularly updated by the State Attorney General's office, and that's what we normally use, and then do our best to help answer any questions that our clients have. So it's, I don't think it would be a very onerous responsibility to make sure that at a minimum landlords, property managers are providing that kind of information. As it relates to source of income discrimination, it's something that Opportunity Council has been concerned about for the last several years. We've seen some attempts at the state level to introduce legislation that would essentially add another class, another criteria to fair housing legislation and have it be statewide. And we've been supportive of those efforts. I think, John can speak to that. I can speak, anecdotally from our housing case managers' experiences. They've seen, again, this is anecdotal. I don't have trend data on this, but it's more common lately as the vacancy rates have gone down, and it's become much more of a seller's market, that people are turning away folks that are showing up with vouchers. So when we think of source of income, we're thinking not only of the housing vouchers, as Galen mentioned, but also whether or not their income is a fixed income source, such as Social Security income, Social Security disability income. And some of our So we're concerned about access to housing units, obviously. We're also concerned about the kind of discrimination that results from not allowing people to, to have access to their rental units because of the type of income or assistance that they have. So for example, what I mean by that is we know that disproportionately our voucher holders are a more diverse population in terms of race and ethnicity. And whether it's not intended at all, implicitly or explicitly, a discrimination issue that's unrelated to the source of income or assistance, the effect is the same. And so that's a big concern.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify on source of income discrimination is something that's kind of near and dear to me in terms of making sure our veterans don't get discriminated against or people with low incomes. What I found is that the enforcement component is challenging. And so I'm wondering if in these other communities that have brought forward policies and legislation, how do they enforce it to make sure that that veteran or that person with the voucher gets a fair shake, basically?
Well, the experts that I've talked to on this issue in Washington State consider the recently enacted ordinance in the city of Vancouver, Washington, to be probably the best, technically the best source of income discrimination ordinance. However, and I think I shared this information with Dan and April just last week, I asked Andy Silver, who was instrumental in leading the effort to get that ordinance passed, said, now that it's been on the books for a little more than a year, how's it going? And one of his comments was, in terms of enforcement, the only mechanism in our source of income discrimination ordinance is to enforce through landlord-tenant court. This would be the one area that I would recommend doing something different. I think ideally there would be some sort of civil fine that the city could enforce. So I'm not an attorney, so I don't know all that's entailed in that, but I just thought I'd share with you the experience of this city from this person's perspective.
Yeah, Peter Raffato. So we do, the primary method of a penalty when we have something along these lines would be a civil infraction. There is also something in our code that we rarely, if ever, use is called a civil fine. But a civil infraction is, we do have that. We do enforce that through code enforcement, it is not. It ends up being prosecuted. Typically, it goes through our code enforcement, and then it would, if it has to go that far, it would go to our prosecutor, and then there's a civil infraction calendar.
So, John, there's probably a lot of people watching right now, and I've been even trying to understand Section 8 vouchers, Social Security vouchers, especially I think because you've worked with Section 8 vouchers.
Oh, yes.
Maybe just to help understand exactly what that is, and although you can't get into the mind of a landlord of why they might not be willing to accept it, what are some of the barriers there that are creating the lack of acceptance or that income discrimination?
Well, basically, it starts with the market situation we have. We have very low vacancy rates. I was trying to find out again this morning if somebody had a good handle on that, but it's got to be around 1%. I think that's a fair guess. And there's a lot of pressure on rents. I've got some statistics on that. And so at a certain point, the amount we're allowed to pay under the Section 8 program maxes out. And the tenant can't pay more than 40% of income for their share of the rent. So the formula is based on the idea that a tenant would pay 30% of their income for rent, and that's what the assistance payment part of it is based on. So the Section 8 voucher program fills in the gap between what's called a fair market rent and what the tenant should be paying at 30% of their income. And that amount is called a housing assistance payment. But because rents all over the United States are going up, every metro market, this is a nationwide phenomenon, and it's particularly acute in Washington because of our dynamic economy, which draws a lot of people in. So there's a lot of higher income people coming into the state for tech jobs and things like that who are, in essence, driving the rents up through supply and demand dynamics. And it makes it really tough on people who are lower income. So I have some statistics that are in the handout I gave you, and the ones here is about Washington State, and you can see overall Washington State is heavily impacted by this nationwide crunch.
Yeah.
And there's lack of supply is one thing, and escalating rents is another, and high demand. All those factors interact and cause a very bad market for people who don't have a lot of means to compete in that market.
So,
And would you also suggest another factor is the low capacity for development of truly affordable multifamily rental units?
Yeah, to have, so basically when the voucher program, that's a very good point. For the most part, although we do dedicate some units to new construction projects as a portion of the project, to develop low-income housing is very expensive because it takes a lot of subsidy because you're trying to keep the rents down. And so you can't just charge what it costs because it costs too much for low-income people to afford. So we have to pull a whole bunch of different sources of subsidy together, and it's kind of a juggling act because we get money from the state, and we get money from the city levy, and we get money from the federal government, and we also get money from private investors. So when you start looking at all the funding sources we have, it's not unusual to have 4 or 5 funding sources in one of these low-income housing projects. Oh, and there's also debt. I forgot to mention debt. So there's always a certain element where we're paying debt to a private investor. So it's very complicated financing, takes a long time to put together. But ultimately, it does work.
Yeah, this back to source of income discrimination. I'm getting used to the table here. Sorry. So I guess what I have some questions around the enforcement piece. You'd mentioned it's the code compliance officer, that is code enforcement officer, that's the individual city staff member that would be enforcing or levying that civil infraction. So that's Bellingham PD, or is that coming out of the planning department?
So I probably should, it's however we want to assign it, but, and Rick can probably talk about this too, but depending on what kind of civil infraction it is, sometimes there will be a departmental response where they try to gain compliance. All of our code enforcement efforts are geared towards gaining compliance. It's not penalty punishment oriented. So in this case, it could be initially out of the planning department, but then eventually the way our system works is then it gets referred to code enforcement typically, and then if that doesn't gain compliance, the code enforcement officers are authorized to essentially issue an infraction. And if you don't get compliance at that point, then it would be prosecuted. So that's kind of the overall picture of how it could work, how some of our other infractions work.
Just a follow-up question. So, how does if I'm trying to rent a home or apartment from you, and you deny me that the lease, and I have a source of income that's like a VASH voucher, right, as a veterans or Section 8, whatever the voucher is, how is it proven that you're discriminating against me or whoever the person is that has that voucher? What's the threshold? What is the legal threshold?
currently, it's not illegal to do that, correct? You're saying if we make it illegal?
Yes.
Okay.
So, I'm sorry, let me back up.
Yeah.
So in the communities that have these ordinances in place, how is the act of discrimination proven in these cases?
Well, some landlords will simply say they don't take Section 8 right now.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll see that in some rental ads.
Yeah,
where
there's
it
a lot
says
of ads
no BHA or
just
no
popping out.
Section 8.
Okay.
That's a big one. And there's some property management companies where you can notice a very clear pattern where they always deny people who have housing vouchers. And like, for instance, I talked with a housing case manager with Opportunity Council, and she's helping a bunch of families try to find housing. And most of them have section vouchers, and she just knows some of the property management companies right off the bat. Even though they don't say it, they always deny her people who have vouchers. So when there's those types of patterns, you could then tell.
Well, I wouldn't underestimate the burden of proof, and I think to substantiate what you just said, there would be a tremendous amount of work that needed to be provided to be able to have a record to show that that was the case. This leads to another related change, and that's where you avoid the discrimination by making it legal. Then you force the issue by requiring the first complete application that meets the requirement to be granted the lease. And that's run into a lot of challenges too, because typically that would ensure that you couldn't discriminate because you met all the requirements, at least. Landlords typically have an open period. They collect a number of leases and they make a selection. To assert that they didn't do it for one reason or another is somewhat problematic in terms of enforcement.
There's other problems with that approach, Rick, and you're probably aware of them, but as long as you brought it up. It sounds like a good idea. But one of the problems is, especially for many of the people that we serve at Opportunity Council, there's a certain amount of if you want to be the first applicant for an opportunity, you've got to have
The privilege.
you got to have a lot of resources to get you to that point, and some people just don't have the resources to be able to be first in line.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem.
Pretty sure that Seattle passed a law to that effect where it was like first in line, and now it's being challenged by a lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be interesting to see how that shakes out.
So as I'm trying to kind of wrap my arms around what the current issues, what we're hearing, so that in our next work session we can kind of determine where we need to go, if we might need some help from Mark to look at some other communities. But certainly there's some tenant right acknowledgement, helping that be more readily accessible. And it sounds like within our code there might be some things that we could talk about that are already allowable. Looking at communities that have tried to tackle the enormous burden of the initial move-in fee, especially if your monies are already sitting, if you're not first-time renting, that you have a substantial amount of money sitting in another pocket of somebody else that's holding that, and rightfully so, as you're cleaning a place, and it does take some time to get that money back. Then it also sounds like there's a source of discrimination concern that although it might be more simple than not to write some legislation that says you can't do that, there's a burden of proof, and we need to do further investigation to really understand what that is, and then also probably to bring in some stakeholders within the landlord community and those who rent to understand what do they perceive to be some of those barriers. I also am hearing, though, with this crunch and this lack of, and when you, Greg, said multifamily housing, I think sometimes people think of multifamily housing as just apartments, but there's a lot of multifamily housing, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, that there's a substantial amount of neighborhoods that just don't allow those types in some really large swaths of land, some zoning. And that could be also causing, because if we don't have more coming online that are reasonably affordable because there are more units in a smaller space, so somebody doesn't have to rent them as high, that might also have to be part of this discussion to understand long-term, how do we get the inventory and keep up with the inventory so that we have really unique sets of housing that can fit for everybody. Not everybody can afford a single-family home, and what I'm also hearing is with the Section 8, if it can only be up to 40% of somebody's income, and they're making $13 an hour, and there's a 3-bedroom, 1-bath that is renting for $1,700, which is kind of a going rate right now, it's $1,500 to $1,700. They wouldn't have enough money even with the Section 8 voucher to even go in to rent that place. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, the percentage of income applies after the subsidy is put on. So let's say somebody has a place that's going to rent for $1,500, and let's say the subsidy was going to be $500. And so the tenant would have to come up with $1,000. So in that case, if the $1,000 was more than 40% of their income, then they wouldn't be able to do that. They have to find a place that costs less It fits in with the federal guidelines that we have.
Yeah.
But at the 40% sounds bad, but it also allows people to get a place where they wouldn't otherwise get one. You know, and people are desperate enough that they're willing to adjust their budget to make it work. And it's not ideal by any means. It used to be just a flat 30%, and that was it. But it wasn't working in a lot of markets throughout the country. This is the whole United States that's affected by this. Almost all metro areas are experiencing exactly what's happening here.
So somebody might have to spend more like 60% of their income, but the Section 8 is only going to cover about 30% subsidy. I'm just trying to understand the Section 8 piece of this, or a senior
Yeah, well, it
certificate
varies property by property, the bedroom size, the family income, but there's a calculation we go through, which is real simple to describe verbally, but it basically allows deductions for minors in the house and things like that, and elderly people get another type of deduction. And so it comes out to it in this formula, and it says this is what the subsidy will be.
Okay.
But the subsidy is based on the difference between the fair market rent and 30% of the person's income. So that's
Okay.
what the subsidy is calculated on. But the person is allowed to go beyond that 30% if that's what it takes for them to get the unit, and that's up to them.
Goodness. Yeah.
And you know, we're seeing a steady increase in rents. In the handout I showed you, or passed out rather, is the one that has the bars on it. And the blue bar is 2015, and the red one is 2016. There's a legend at the bottom. And then the green one is 2017. And so we have a pattern here of, if you look at the percentage of rent increases, but the average rent in 2015 went up $45. In 2016, it was $51. And so far, in 2017, it's $57.
Yeah.
So those are cumulative increases, of course. That's going up that much each year.
Also, just anecdotally, for students, I've heard this year rents are going up $300, $400 on leases. It's just,
Yeah,
I've heard it more this year than any years in the past.
Yeah, these are averages. We have some that have gone up a couple $100s that we've seen in our system too. And the percentages are there too. 6.2% in 2015, 6.5% in 2016, and so far in 2017 we're going at 7.4%. So the rate of increase is going up also.
Just to clarify, that was for house leases, not apartment rents. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question. I think I'm just going to voice my frustration with this process, not this process, but the process of housing in general, having done this for a number of years now. I feel like the things that we're talking about today are important. I think that no one should be discriminated against based on how they get their income. I think I think pretty much everyone could probably agree to that. I think that there's the interesting proposals that Galen's proposing in terms of kind of flattening out those front-end moving costs and spreading those out over several months. I think those things that could be a good thing. I'd want to have input from landlords and get their perspective on it as well. But what's frustrating, though, is that we can do all these things, and we're nibbling around the edges of this big problem that we have here. And in your chart, John, you show that rent increases went up by last 3 years by about $160, $170. So we know that based on studies that have been performed by the Department of Commerce, when rents go up in the community by $100, homelessness goes up between 6 and 32%. In Bellingham, we're in the middle, kind of lower end of what those increases look like. So for folks that are at the margins of being able to afford homes or have barriers to housing, they're the first ones that are at risk and often become homeless. Okay. Then there's the gap or the lack of middle housing. So folks that go to work, they have kids, maybe probably two incomes, who are unable to afford, in many cases, not able to afford the home that they live in right now. If they were on the market right now, they wouldn't be able to buy their own home. So I know that other counties look to Bellingham, other communities look to Bellingham because we have a housing levy here. We have a pipeline of housing that is coming online. Other communities just don't have that. Skagit doesn't have that. Island doesn't have that. And they have all looked at like how to do that. I guess I'm asking the big. I feel like the buzzer's about to go off. I'm going to throw the basketball from midcourt and try to make the basket, and it's not going to go in. I'm trying to figure out how, beyond the housing levy, what else can we be doing to whether it be Bellingham or whether it be Whatcom County or advocacy at the state level, be doing to address this shortfall of 164,000 affordable homes. What in the expertise of the panel that we have before us, what can we do as policymakers to help address the systemic pieces and not just nibble around the edges?
Well, for the reason that John described earlier, one of the reasons that there's a lack of inventory of housing that's truly affordable for lower income households is that it doesn't pencil. So, we all have to acknowledge that. And so that's why if we want to provide housing that's affordable for people who are working at all different local wages, including very low wages, then we need to figure out how we're going to, put those units on the ground. And, my friend and colleague Paul Schisler, the framework, it's a very simple framework, but the framework that he puts forward is that there's three approaches. They all have to work together. It's around policies, funding, and capacity. And they all interplay together. So, your zoning policies are related to capacity, but so are things like your funding policies. Having a housing levy brought not just new projects, but brought new players and new developers to the table. Mercy Housing building Eleanor Apartments, for example. Opportunity Council, we hadn't developed a new project since 1999, and now we've, working on 22 North. Not something that we would have done had it not been for the local housing levy. So there are a lot of things that you can do, and you can look to other communities too to see what they've done. What happened in Seattle with their housing affordability and livability agenda, the HALA process, came up with some very interesting, useful policies. Not easy politically to do, but when you think about the need for infill multifamily housing throughout the city, that's something that I think our community really has to get serious about discussing.
Yeah, there is another approach too that's been used a lot in California, and it's called inclusionary zoning ordinances, and that's a real political hot potato, as you can imagine. And yeah, they have been doing it in California for years, just by necessity. And I know the director in Santa Barbara quite well in California, and they have their housing is so crazy there, it costs like about $500,000 a unit to develop multifamily housing. So the developers can either include a percentage of their inventory and make it affordable. It could be 20% or whatever formula they're using, or they can pay into this fund where they're paying a very large payment, and I'm talking several $100,000, to avoid putting an affordable unit in their portfolio. So it's a tough thing to do politically, and there are problems with it if, let me just throw this out because I don't want to stir the pot too much, but if Bellingham passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance and the rest of Whatcom County didn't have one, guess where all the development would go?
Yeah. That's true.
And that's just one of those market factors that plays into it.
John, on this piece of paper where it says landlords as of January 1st, those are landlords declining that aren't participating with the vouchers, Section 8? That's what that is?
Well, some of them obviously have declined, but this particular thing shows the number of landlords we have has been decreasing. So we had 415 landlords And some landlords will have multiple properties, so it's important to remember that. And the Housing Authority actually places a lot of vouchers and units that we own too. Or we don't place them, the tenant finds our units, and then we have some that are actually dedicated to that. And now we're down to, in 2017, we have 330 landlords participating. In 2016, our overall participation rate in the voucher program was 99%. That means we leased 99% of our vouchers, which was based on a lot of relationships we have with landlords over the years. And a lot of landlords like the program because they're guaranteed most of their rent. And many landlords are in the lower half of the market, where they don't have real spiffy properties and things like that. And so it helps them sometimes to attract people and get people who can still afford the rents they're trying to get.
So where's the decline? Why the decline? Just because they can go out and get whatever they want, or?
Yeah, it's a seller's market right now.
There's huge competition for every unit.
Yeah.
No matter
You'll
what.
hear people saying, people that have, I talked to one, if you talk to the mom and pop landlord, say somebody who's renting an ADU or an apartment in their home. I talked to somebody yesterday, he was shocked. He hadn't rented it out in a while because he had a long-term renter. That person left. He got 80 applications the day it went on Craigslist.
Oh, there you go, yeah. Mm-hmm. April.
Yeah, anecdotally, we were hanging out with some soccer parents, and they had moved because their rent increased $300 for a 3-bedroom, 1-bath this year. And when they decided not to do it, it would have brought up to $1,400. They moved out, and then the landlord put it up to $1,700 and got it within a day filled. So yeah, I think, and it's, of course, it's not unique. As we've said, this is kind of up and down the I-5 corridor. I think in thinking about how we could move forward with more discussions, I like what Dan was saying about, there's these systemic issues. I think that we're going to have to determine what those are, and is this council prepared to have conversations around some of those issues related to housing and inventory and zoning and things that create these pinches and these crunches. And then, of course, outside the cookie, I guess, what are things that we can do sooner than later, and then work with the community on what that looks like, whether it be understanding what the Landlord-Tenant Act is, whether it be looking at source of income discrimination. I think there was a part, Greg, and I really want to acknowledge and thank you for bringing it up here, is that, there's these implicit discriminations in these systems. And I think when we just look at this broadly, we have to continually remember how those systems are set up so certain people don't get to succeed. And that is generally people of color. It can be seniors, it can be people with disabilities as well. And that as we have this conversation, that we shouldn't lose track of that this isn't just, making sure that people on Section 8, have this opportunity. This is ensuring that people, however we move forward, are getting a level playing field, or at least an equitable playing field, in order to prosper in their life. And that's really what our charge is, I think, as a council, is ensuring that people have access to reach their full potential. So, yeah, I would hope kind of before the end of this, I think what would be good is for us to try to figure out where do we want to go next? Are we ready to hear perspective from landlords? Would we like Mark to maybe go out and do some research and bring back some information with staff for us? Certainly before our public comment, I think it would be good for us to know what we want to do next.
Sure, I had a question for Kurt. Kurt, you've been around, can you come to the microphone? Or Brian, anybody you can sit anywhere. You've been around for a while. Have we not on some housing projects set aside 10, 20% or something for affordable housing? It's been a long time ago. I can't remember the last time we did it.
There hasn't been any specific requirements to do so. We, beyond one project recently off of Meridian Telegraph, it was a church campus, and as a part of that component, they did offer up a percentage of their units to be affordable. So
but that is a tool if we wanted to, we could pursue that. But we're not in, go ahead, Ray.
Well, we have had an assessment of inclusionary zoning, and our market would not support it at this point, but it's something you reassess. Our comp plan asks us to periodically keep checking to see if the numbers work it. And we're just not as red hot in terms of the amount of construction, for example, Seattle or
Yeah.
Tacoma or other areas that warrant it, and the demand's not high enough. That's not all a bad thing, because if it doesn't pencil, it means we are a little more affordable than some of those other areas. So we can bring that back for
Okay.
review. What I would say is that in looking at approaches, the easy things that have great benefit, we've done. So what we're looking for is an aggregation of marginal gains, little bits here and there that taken together cumulatively may advance things. And that's the hardest thing to
Yeah.
do. So it's not one magic bullet, it's hundreds of actions cumulatively might make a change.
I think we could reach out to the landlord association. I don't know who the person is now that runs it. They were heavily involved when we started the rental registration.
Washington Landlord Association?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I forget who the person's name is, but
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts,
I have a
Dan?
connection there.
Well, I think that's the next step is to talk with landlords and I don't know, like the broader real estate community, but certainly landlords to get their perspective. Yeah, I'd like to hear different. I know that you all are housing providers, and Galen, you're representing the students here, but I think there are other renters in our community that we could also hear from as well.
Oh,
And I
Peter.
think I'd just like to say, if I could, there are other nonprofit housing developers that you could engage in this conversation as well. I think Mercy Housing in particular, because of their work in so many other Western Washington markets, might have some useful lessons of what they've learned and what they've seen other smaller cities do besides just Seattle.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned. It's somewhat of a detail, but I didn't want to leave it as maybe oversimplified. When I was talking about our code enforcement process, that's just the overall process. And, Rick mentioned, establishing the burden of proof. Dan mentioned it. Whenever you get it, the devil's in the details in a lot of these things. And I've seen many times where, we got it on the books, and then the work to get one case to a point where you feel like you can actually prosecute it, if you have to get to that point, is a challenge, and there's always a resource issue that comes to that. So I just didn't want to leave it as, we can throw that into a civil infraction process, and it's no big deal. It's something that we would have to take some time to understand and identify resources.
April, then Galen. Go ahead.
I was curious for the existing anti-discrimination laws with housing, like race and gender. Does that go through code enforcement, or how are those existing anti-discrimination laws enforced?
I believe that's typically a state-level enforcement. The AG's office has they have an office that they've dedicated, and I believe it's the Commission on Human Rights or something like that at the state level that focuses on that.
Some larger jurisdictions, like the city of Seattle, do it in-house. They have a fair housing office that does that. But normally those complaints go to either directly to HUD, to the state, or to one of two organizations in the state that are fair housing centers. The one on the western side is based in Tacoma. It's a nonprofit organization.
Okay. Well, so they're kind of seeing that there's kind of two spaces here, and I'm wondering if both need to be taken up by this committee or in this setting. And I'm thinking we might need to separate them. We may be able to go forward with this work committee talking about nibbling around the edges and what we can do. But I'm wondering if this committee is interested in looking at those kind of systemic crunches that we have to have a broader discussion around, with whether it be infill or looking at different types of housing availability, that we could have that in the planning discussion, but maybe not in this forum, where we could have a lot more staff input and understand, like, how can we be working at these in tandem and in parallel, so we're not just kind of working around that with
Yeah, we
that,
can
so
do
that we can, they're going to be hard to separate, but I think it would be really good to make sure we're not losing touch of both of those. What do you think, Councilmember Hamel?
I think having a discussion on, I'd like to have a discussion on the infill toolkit, for example. I think that that'd be a good refresher for all of us, including members of the community that might have some questions about what that looks like. I'd like to have staff's input on different housing types as well. But I think what you're talking about is like zoning issues and such. So, I think having some having some staff expertise on those discussions would be helpful. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
And kind of separate
Could I
as
make
the
a comment
Sure,
too?
go ahead, John.
Greg just reminded me that we had quite a lot of effort that went into the chat
Yeah.
thing we did in the city and the county. It was a comprehensive thing. And there's a lot of good recommendations in the chat, and it doesn't hurt to revisit those.
No.
And the levy came out of that.
Yeah.
And I would encourage anybody that's reviewing that report to also look at some of the recommendations that weren't adopted because they didn't get a majority vote. Because, maybe our housing market has evolved to such a point where some of those other recommendations might get a different look this time around.
Mr. President, you had a question. Brian will be next.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Name and address,
Thank you.
please.
I'm Michael, also from the City
Address.
Council. The address, 210 Lottie Street. So Gene probably remembers about 5-6 years ago, we actually, the council did consider an inclusive housing ordinance. But it was confined to only those cases where we were giving a significant upzone. And the idea is when you give a significant upzone, you can take a little bit of that back for the public good. It didn't go forward, but I think it might be useful to, I think this is really nibbling around the edges, because that's not the majority of cases. But it might be one of those nibbles we might want to look at again. When is it fair now under current conditions to require an inclusive housing component? And I've asked Mr. Nabafel to see if he can find that. It was about 6 years ago, and we can just look at that again, and maybe it's time, maybe it's not.
Brian?
I just wanted to offer that, and some of you are aware, a couple of years ago, Mayor Kelly and then Council Member Seth Fleetwood led a work group on looking at some of the chat recommendations, and really it was more looking at what had occurred here in Bellingham, and there were some recommendations that came out of that. So I think as part of that, wherever the next steps go, we'd be happy to reference that work as well. I know the recommendations that were made and some things that were put in place, so just wanted to make sure that component was recognized.
And I think just so that we're all clear, so we can either get nods or if we need to make a motion, it sounds like we will continue this work group in really looking at those renter barriers related to tenant rights, source of income discrimination, and potentially even understanding what would that look like to string out payments or give people options of payments as they're trying to get their rents back from or their deposits back from others. And then the greater is a direction to staff to say the planning committee would like to have conversations, revisit the chat, revisit some of those things that were not implemented. Of course, like the president was talking about with that inclusionary, if there's a upzone, and where can we make greater systemic changes? What are the suggestions, and what are some of the, where could we make some larger steps sooner than later?
Okay.
And then of
Sounds
course that
good.
could go. So
Okay.
we'll keep these related to that, and I'll certainly send out some
Right.
invites within
Yeah,
the
we need to get a hold of the people.
tenant community.
Tenant
Okay,
community.
just to be clear. Do you need a motion or vote on that?
No, I don't
to
think
direct
so.
staff, or are you?
As I understand it, what I'm hearing you say is you'll reconvene a committee with a new group of
Yep.
folks to provide additional information to see how to advance the rental issues, the more operational rental issues, in terms of dealing with applications and denials and dealing with rights being provided information. That's kind of a nuts and bolts issue of how best to do it. But I'm also hearing that you would like us to prioritize, administration to prioritize, talking with you more about broader initiatives that could address some of the housing issues and some of the tools. And among that might be infill toolkit, its background, so we're all on the same page, and application, and perhaps some of the other approaches, updating the study that was done on inclusionary housing, just sort of what does that look like and what are the markers you'd look for changes, or other programs that might be used to. So it's an informational session to bring that back.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Now, we have the last 10 minutes for anybody in the audience that wants to come up and make any comments. Is there anybody here that would like to make any comments? Go ahead, sir. Come to the microphone. Yep.
My name is Mike Parker, and I work at the Opportunity Council with Greg Winter. First, I want to thank you all for having this discussion. I love listening to this and being a part of this. I do want to offer that if you do another session, the Waccamaw Service Center is a landlord liaison that we just started April 1st. The reason why I offer that as a potential resource, just doing a lot of talking to landlords, going to rental associations, trying to get kind of a lead on what's going on in that landlord community. Obviously, one of the big focuses for us is opening doors for people that have vouchers, that have disabilities, that come to the Opportunity Council for assistance. So just offering myself up, and the landlord liaison's name is Adrian Solenberger. And then just to remind the council that that is partially funded with city funds, and so she works actively with your it's not code enforcement, but the folks that are doing your rental registration program. And part of the charge also for this position is to be a resource to landlords about fair housing and those types of things. So we kind of have a three-pronged thing: opening doors, doing some education, and maybe mitigating some disputes with that position. But I just want to offer that up as you head down the road and look in this a little further. And then just one last comment. And I definitely hear where Dan is coming from when we kind of nibble around the edges. A whole lot of nibbles makes a bite. And with this particular one, with source of income, you know, that public display of kind of shutting people out, of discrimination, there's a value to doing that. And I know it's going to be challenging to figure out how to enforce it. But even if the advertising alone is more kind or benign, let's say, not hostile, there's a value to that. So I just want to bring that up, that when folks see that overt discrimination, that microaggression, they're definitely going to feel it. So even if we can't stamp it out completely, even if it is challenging for people to get legal redress, there's still going to be value. Even if we're stuck where Andy Silver's group is a little stuck, right, and what to do next. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Hey, Mark, are you clear what you'd be looking for? Come on down. I just want to ask about voter voucher discrimination, source of income discrimination, and what we've been talking about. Something to research.
I am now. I wasn't sure who it was being assigned to, but if that's the intention, then I understand.
What other
that,
cities are doing?
So the process
Yeah.
things, mostly. The sort of, Rick was describing those process issues regarding access to current rentals.
Okay,
Sure.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I think
April, go ahead.
in the operation, I'd also like to understand, I think we've only mentioned a little bit of source of income discrimination. I know there's some concern within the community of those who rent that source of income discrimination could be, you have a student that has no income and then you require somebody to sign on. So there's some confusion of like, well, would I be discriminating against a student who has no income whenever I'm asking? So I think if we really understood the full scope of what are all the discriminations of income and what those could look like, so we have the facts before we venture anywhere into kind of gray, mushy areas, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
And Mark, I'd be happy to share some contacts I have at the Low Income Housing Alliance, some state legislative staff, and some people at Columbia Legal Services that have been doing a lot of research in support of the statewide legislative effort for source of income discrimination. So I'll pass those on to you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, I want to thank everybody. This has been a great discussion, and this is years ago when we had conversations about what a committee is supposed to do. This is it, to convene and listen and then either come up with legislation or not. And rather than do it up there and try to mishmash it, this is really what committees have been set up to do. So I'm very happy that April brought this forward and everybody's participated. So we'll notice the next one when we get enough information on who will come. And I want to, Galen, thank you. Everybody, thank you for coming and being a
Thanks to
part.
Galen's professor
Yep.
for letting him
Let him
out of
leave,
class
huh?
today. Yeah.
Meeting adjourned.